All right, welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And in this episode, I'll be looking at the ICE shooting of a woman in Minnesota. I will also look at Mark Burnett, a man largely responsible for expanding Trump's role as a media star. And interestingly, I will also examine the role of Roma Downey, Mark Burnett's wife, as a propagator of Christian media propaganda. So stick around for that because I will explain how Roma Downey's New Age Christian messaging, or whatever you want to call it, seems like an attempt to lure less typical viewers into possible right wing message coded viewership of her so called Christian media. And despite her content probably not typically being explicitly right wing, I will explain why it still might function as a pipeline into MAGA style thinking. Because her husband, Mark Burnett, is closely associated with Donald Trump after all. Also, do Christian media and reality TV have any similarities to professional wrestling, which Trump is also tied to? What about UFC fighting, boxing, and stuff like that? I'll get into how all of that stuff can easily tie together and how it's helped severely dumb this country down over the decades. Basically, I will look at how even apolitical spirituality historically gets mobilized and exploited during rightward political shifts, and how different general messages blend together into right wing ideology. So, for some of you, I think that could be an interesting topic. I think I will present a clear, historically grounded way to see the pattern without turning it into a conspiracy theory. Because my point about that isn't that it's some elaborate conspiracy theory, just that there's a bunch of different similar messages and overall themes that kind of tie together. But first, let's look at the main event, the tragic shooting in Minnesota. Now, as I did with my Charlie Kirk episode, I will spare you any sort of performance where I cynically try to sound more outraged or emotional than I actually am. Because in truth, I'm not really that emotional of a person to begin with, and also I'm just too jaded to feel that emotional about these things anymore, to be honest. I mean, we still have school shootings happening all the time, mass shootings, bombings, Trump the pirate stealing Venezuelan oil tankers, full blown genocides that I'm not supposed to criticize, and so on and so forth. I just can't be so emotional about all this crap anymore. It'd be just too much. I mean, how many tears can you shed or whatever? How emotional can I get about just this endless stream of stories that is just constantly coming up. But anyway, the main headline, yes, a fatal shooting by a U.S. immigration agent in Minneapolis has triggered overnight protests and renewed criticism of federal immigration enforcement operating inside cities that have sought to limit cooperation with ICE. However, as the other 98% site has noted on Facebook, this is not just promoted as an immigration matter. Trump's idiot cult has made clear that the ICE presence is intended as a 2,000 agent fraud crackdown in Minnesota. So apparently, ICE is now somehow tasked with fraud investigations? Weird, huh? It's a little bit weird. I guess when you don't believe in actual law and order, you just blend all these different departments together till eventually they're just sort of indistinguishable and you don't even know what their actual role is supposed to be anymore. Because that's how Trump is. He doesn't actually believe in law and order. He doesn't understand the distinctions that are supposed to exist between different departments. And the MAGA movement in general doesn't care about such distinctions either a whole lot. Anyway, the woman who was killed has been identified by federal authorities and the media as 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. Immigration officials claim she attempted to strike agents with her vehicle. Justification not adequately revealed in the video footage, but a defense frequently used by U.S. police and federal officers in lethal use of force cases involving cars. So keep that in mind. This is a very common sort of defense that they will put out there if there is a fatal shooting, especially. So after watching the video numerous times, you can see they are drawing their guns and attempting to enter her vehicle. In contradiction to what right wingers claim, she's shown in the video waving the ICE vehicles through. Then, as they approach in a threatening way, she starts actually backing away. And motorists back up before driving forward, often to reposition for better visibility, to navigate tight turns like in driveways or alleys, or to get a better angle on the road. The ICE agents quickly crowd the vehicle in the video as she's starting to drive forward, then very rapidly unload some ammunition into her, shooting her in the face as she started driving away. This all happens very quickly, mind you. It's a it's a very short video actually of the event itself. And as a result of their action, the out of control vehicle then hits another car. Keep that in mind. So, yes, you have the initial death, the initial murder, but there was also an element of reckless endangerment because you now had, or in the video, you have an out of control car, and it's clear that the motorist is no longer in control because they are deceased. They were shot repeatedly. So the agent was clearly at her side at first and was moving to the front with his gun drawn. As someone noted on Facebook, the woman was told to clear the space she was occupying. That's what she did. She drove back a few inches so that she doesn't hit the guy, pointed the wheels right, and drove. So that's what somebody noted on Facebook, and it's accurately stated regarding what happens on the video. You can clearly see all that. They were trying to grab at her, so she may have reflexively stepped harder on the gas pedal, as people tend to do when you're not, you know, in complete control of the situation. There was an officer grabbing at the car door and then, reaching at her through the window, and she was trying to drive away at the time already. And then the gunfire happened. Also, the ICE agent was not actually run over, which was something Trump immediately stated about this. That would be another orange-faced lie. So here's what Trump said about it. The woman driving the car was very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, who then violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer, who seems to have shot her in self defense. Based on the attached clip, it is hard to believe he is alive, but is now recovering in the hospital. End quote. Well, he was never actually run over, never in the hospital because of her driving. All that was just made up by Trump. So, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey rejected the right wing accounts of what happened, saying the agent who fired the shots acted recklessly and should never have opened fire in a residential neighborhood. The story doesn't just end there. According to KSTP News, and I'm quoting them now, apparent ICE agents were at a Minneapolis high school on Wednesday after federal agents shot and killed a woman earlier in the day. A Roosevelt High School student told 5 Eyewitness News that ICE agents pulled up to the entrance sometime during Wednesday afternoon, then blocked portions of the road. So they didn't just pack it up and go home or anything like that at the end of the day. Anyway, continuing to quote the article, the student added that he saw ICE agents chasing people adding that someone was tackled by federal agents. A video from the scene shows a person lying on the ground with federal agents surrounding them. The student noted that school administrators and staff were trying to get ICE off school property while ushering students and people away from the crowd. Some students were pepper sprayed during the incident, the student added. A video from the scene shows a federal agent deploying pepper spray into a crowd. End quote. And that article, if you want to read it, is called Apparent ICE Presence at Roosevelt High School Causes Chaotic Scene. And indeed, that's what ICE has been doing all across the country, just creating chaotic scenes, in some cases harming people, and in some cases, like this one from yesterday, they have taken lives. So, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, the puppy killer who increasingly looks like a plastic fish slash cat slash woman hybrid, said Renee Nicole Good was guilty of active domestic terrorism. That's right. She's saying that the person who was shot was a domestic terrorist because MAGA now calls anyone that they don't like a terrorist or a gangster or an Antifa agent or a communist or anything else they can come up with. You know, eventually it might become some other sort of buzzword, enemy of the week, and they'll try to claim that everyone is part of that. Remember when groomers was way more common as something they would call everybody? Well, that's considered a little bit passe, I suppose. So now everybody's a terrorist or a gangster or something like that. But here's the thing, when you start calling everyone a terrorist, it kind of gives the game away. Not everyone, in fact, not even every violent act itself is terrorism, you goddamn lunatics. Anyway, multiple videos posted by bystanders indeed show the moments leading up to the shooting, which occurred at approximately 10:25 a.m. on Wednesday. Some videos are better than others. In fact, there's one where somebody's kind of grossly hawking up a loogie, and that actually kind of distracts from the footage, to be honest. So I watched that video a few times trying to better appreciate what it depicted. But on those few occasions, I kept on getting distracted by the person, you know, having phlegm or whatever and hacking it up. So that is not the best video. But from several angles, a maroon SUV is visible, stopped in the middle of a residential street, with people gathered on the sidewalks nearby. Some appear to be protesting or shouting at law enforcement. Unmarked vehicles and law enforcement trucks can be seen in the area. And apparently, from what I understand, you know, this was not a protester that was shot, at least not necessarily. Again, ICE agents approach the SUV with guns drawn and order the driver to exit, dropping some F bombs in the process because ICE is so professional. One agent pulls at the driver's side door handle while another stands closer to the front of the vehicle. As the SUV begins to move forward, at least two gunshots are heard. I believe there were actually three, however. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. The vehicle then veers out of control and crashes into a parked car further down the street. So the FBI, which routinely investigates shootings involving federal agents, has taken over the case. But if you have faith in Trump's FBI, well, I don't know. I don't even know what to tell you. Do you really think anyone in Trump's orbit will try to have an objective take on what happened? Never. There is not a snowball's chance in hell that they're going to be objective about any of this. They have an agenda. They're going to stick to that agenda 100%, or at least 98 or 99%. There you go, for the people who want maybe a more accurate percentage point. There you go. But such investigations are internal to the federal system and rarely result in criminal charges against officers. That's a pattern well documented by civil liberties groups. And just if you've had enough years on this earth, you know that that's the case. So the shooting took place amid a significant expansion of immigration enforcement in Minnesota, and apparently they're also targeting non immigrants as well. And federal authorities have confirmed that large numbers of ICE agents have been deployed to the Minneapolis area as part of a broader White House push to increase arrests and deportations, largely under the direction of people like Stephen Miller and that Homan guy. So historically, ICE operations intensify under both Republican and Democratic administrations, despite campaign rhetoric to the contrary. Keep that in mind too. So the antipathy against ICE is only just now starting to shift the Democratic Party a little bit further in an anti ICE direction. And Minneapolis has limited cooperation with ICE through city policy, reflecting longstanding opposition by immigrant communities and abolitionist organizers, the people who want to get rid of ICE. And these policies do not prevent ICE from operating in the city, but restrict local police from assisting in civil immigration enforcement, which makes sense because guess what? Immigration is federal. So they should not need local police assistance on average anyway. And anti authoritarian groups argue that even these measures fall far short since ICE remains free to conduct armed raids with little accountability, practically no accountability. But we'll see if that's ever changed in the future. And again, Mayor Fry using an expletive in a public statement. He told them to get the F out. He called on ICE agents to leave the city following the killing. While the mayor is a Democrat who supported police reform after the 2020 uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd, critics note that his administration has continued to fund and expand policing while tolerating federal enforcement actions against residents, at least up to this point. Now, this does appear to be a turning point for the mayor, and of course, it's a potential turning point for the country too. Well, among many different turning points, and the killing really fits a broad pattern. ICE is a relatively new agency created in 2003 after the September 11 attacks, yet it's rapidly become one of the most feared arms of the U.S. security state. Its agents are armed, operate with wide discretion, and are shielded by the same legal doctrines that protect police, including expansive interpretations of officer safety, which is basically a catch all term that's intended to almost have complete blanket immunity for their policies and their individual actions. And again, we'll see if that will change. It will require public pressure to make a dent in that whole attitude. So, claims that vehicles constitute lethal threats are often used after the fact to justify shootings, particularly when victims are ostensibly liberals or leftists or just people of color. And at the same time, community protests against ICE presence are routinely framed as disorder rather than as resistance to an agency whose core function is harassment, detention, deportation, abuse, family separation, and increasingly outright murder. And it's also a very partisan organization at this point, too. Keep in mind that Trump has done everything in his power to make ICE into a MAGA group. So, yes, that's another point to consider in this whole discussion. So, as protests continued into the night, The killing of Renee Nicole Good has become another flashpoint in ongoing struggles over borders, policing, and who is allowed to exist safely in public space. All right, on to segment two, which I call the peripheral poop head of the week, and that is Mark Burnett, as promised. So, British American television producer James Mark Burnett helped remake Donald Trump's public image through mass media long before Trump had entered electoral politics. Born in London in 1960, Burnett built a reality TV empire that reached global audiences and reshaped how media personalities cross over into politics. Burnett first founded Mark Burnett Productions in 1995, focusing on reality and unscripted television. His early work included the adventure race series Eco Challenge, which laid the groundwork for what would become Survivor. Survivor debuted on American TV in the year 2000, became one of the most watched summer series in decades, and is often credited with launching the modern reality TV boom. And in 2004, NBC premiered The Apprentice, a competition show that pitted aspiring entrepreneurs against one another in business challenges, with Donald Trump as the host and the catchphrase "You're fired" as its trademark. You know, that is a trademark that Trump has carried over into his career as a president. And although Trump was already a known figure in real estate and tabloids, the show brought him sustained primetime exposure, and it was to tens of millions of viewers and reinforced a mythology of his wealth and his leadership. So, from a critical perspective like mine, it can be seen as a commercial performance that blurred lines between entertainment and civic credibility, contributing to Trump's later political capital. And Burnett's television influence extended beyond The Apprentice. Over his career, he produced dozens of franchises across multiple networks, major networks too, including Survivor, Shark Tank, and The Voice. Shows he developed have aired on more than 15 networks in over 70 countries, generating more than 4,000 hours of programming. In addition to launching Mark Burnett Productions, he later co founded Lightworkers Media in 2009 with actress Roma Downey. Lightworkers focuses on faith based and Christian oriented media. Boy, I messed up the word media there. But anyway, it really shows you that media producers can leverage niche markets and ideological audiences and sort of expand their reach. Burnett's industry roles also include serving as president of the United Artists Media Group from 2014 to 2018 and as chairman of MGM Worldwide Television Group from 2018 to 2022. And he also, you know, gained industry recognition, including multiple Primetime Emmy Awards and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And of course, he's won awards for his shows and all that kind of stuff. So, from an anti hierarchical standpoint, Burnett's career demonstrates how media production functions as cultural power, shaping public attention, manufacturing celebrity, and reinforcing capitalist norms through competitive and repetitive formats. Reality TV formats often dramatize individual success and competition while normalizing surveillance and brand narratives, all things that are relevant to, guess what, dictatorships and authoritarian regimes and cults. So, as such, figures like Burnett can be seen as architects of spectacle that prop up elite identities and market logic influencing public consciousness beyond mere entertainment. So, in late 2024, then President elect Donald Trump appointed Mark Burnett as the United States Special Envoy to the United Kingdom, sort of like a thanks for helping me get my foot in the door as a dictator. And this role is distinct from the traditional ambassador post because it does not require Senate confirmation and reflects Trump's tendency to give political or diplomatic positions to longtime associates and cultural collaborators. So, Trump framed Burnett's appointment as leveraging the distinguished career in television production and business to strengthen cultural ties, trade, investment, and other areas of cooperation between the United States and UK governments. But of course, it's also because Burnett was just kissing Trump's behind. That's another part of it. The ego is an aspect here. So, of course, it's a lot to do with who you know. It's not so much about political legitimacy. The fact that he had such expertise. He just helped Trump, and Trump kind of paid him back. So, on to the third segment, which I call the Fetid Fever Dream Flashback of the Week. And this is about Roma Downey. Roma Downey isn't a figure who's been at the center of a major criminal or career ending scandal the way many Hollywood stars have been. There's no widely documented sexual harassment lawsuit, violent crime, or major fraud that's been tied to her actions. So that's not really a part of my critique here. In fact, I'm not really even critiquing her that much. I'm just noting that she's a part of a pattern. And so what has been controversial about her? What am I picking on her for? Is it just because she's a Christian and I'm an atheist? Well, no. Although that's part of it, I suppose, but that's more coincidental and tangential. I will get into the prominence of religious content in media in a little bit, but first, I have to get into one of the funniest scandals of her career and get that out of the way first. So this one is weird. There was a mini series she did or a movie she did called The Bible, and there was a little bit of a casting controversy in 2013 when this movie came out. One of the more you know quirky things here is that as people noted on social media, an actor portraying Satan in the History Channel's The Bible looked like President Barack Obama, who was president at the time. So, yeah. And I looked at the article about it from the Christian Post, and you know what? I actually see it. They did make Satan look quite a lot like Barack Obama. So that might have been a little bit of less than subtle messaging uh, involved there. And Downey and her husband, Mark Burnett, said they were heartbroken that this distracted from their project, and they insisted it was unintentional. And the History Channel publicly denied that any likeness was intentional. But let's uh let's look at the main critique here though after that little weird scandal. If you don't believe me about that, go ahead and check that article out later. The actor, whoever played Satan there, he actually does look like Barack Obama. But interestingly, some of her content has generated critiques from some religious commentators. Some fringe Christian watchdog outlets have accused Downey of promoting New Age ideas or beliefs that aren't strictly Orthodox Christian doctrine. And those claims focus on her spiritual language, like seeing God in everyone, and her educational background rather than on some wrongdoing. But it is an interesting question. Why might she have some new age style messaging in her uh, Christian content? Well, to start with, point number one is that the new age messaging is a funnel, not a contradiction. So, at first glance, the critique aimed at Roma Downey is odd. Some conservative Christian commentators accuse her of being too new age, too soft, too universalist. And if she's part of a conservative media ecosystem, why would many conservative Christians still allow or tolerate that? Well, the answer isn't theological consistency, it's audience capture. Here's how this can work as a funnel. You've got the soft spiritual language like God is love, light, angels, hope, unity, etc. It's broadly appealing and non threatening. That language attracts people who might not normally watch explicitly conservative Christian programming. And it can also draw spiritually curious viewers, for lack of a better term. And you get also perhaps some apolitical or liberal leaning audience members to tune in as well. You have people disillusioned with institutions but who want to still draw meaning, from this type of content. And once viewers are inside the ecosystem, the surrounding media environment matters more than the initial message. So the new age elements don't need to be an end point, they function as a gateway aesthetic. So uh, power systems don't recruit people solely by announcing themselves in some explicit way. They recruit through familiarity, comfort, and emotional resonance a lot of the time. That's often like a first tactic that will be employed. And point number two, I'm dealing with, in this point, about Mark Burnett, Trump, and the separation of tone from structure. So, Mark Burnett's importance here isn't about him inserting explicit pro Trump slogans into religious content, it's about format and power literacy. Mark Burnett understands myth making, hero narratives, moral binaries, using spectacle over substance, emotional identification over rational argument. And this is the same skill set that made The Apprentice work and helped normalize Trump as a commanding figure long before politics entered the picture. So even if Roma Downey's on screen messaging feels gentle or apolitical, it exists within a production logic that simplifies moral conflict, elevates authority figures, frames redemption as submission to a higher order, rewards loyalty and faith over questioning. And that's not uniquely right wing, but it's compatible with right wing messaging when the political context shifts. And it certainly has in recent decades. The rightward shift is very it's not just obvious. It sort of is the main cultural context right now in America. There are attempts to shift back in the other direction, but it was really created largely through media environments like this. You've also got the fact that Christian media, reality TV, and professional wrestling kind of share DNA, if you think about it. And the key similarity is what is called kayfabe. In professional wrestling, kayfabe is the agreement that the audience knows it's staged, right? So there's a little bit of a wink there. The emotions are still meant to be real. Heroes and villains are morally obvious. Questioning the structure breaks the experience, and Christian media and reality TV operate largely the same way. If you really think about it, like everybody knows there's a little bit of showmanship and razzle dazzle involved, but it's like a blending of the fake and the real into something that actually is real that people will act upon. So just like wrestling is both, faked and real at the same time, there's always a little bit of a wink to the audience. You can still say that it is a real sport in a sense. So the word kayfabe likely comes from carnival or wrestling slang, possibly a coded or pig Latin style distortion of the word fake or to be fake, used so outsiders wouldn't understand when wrestlers were talking about the act. And the exact etymology isn't fully settled, but it's emerged in early 20th century wrestling culture as insider jargon. Now it kind of is a popular term, but for a while it was more of an obscure term. Today, the term is often used more broadly to describe any system that relies on a shared performative belief where questioning the structure itself is treated as too disruptive. So, the shared traits here, you have clear moral roles. Good people are good, bad people are bad, complexity is discouraged. Authority is largely performative. Pastors, judges, hosts, or chosen figures are framed as legitimate because the format says so. You don't need any logic beyond that. The president in this case says that the the system he's putting in place is legitimate, so that's what makes it legitimate. There are no greater standards needed beyond that. And conflict within the system is, uh, it's immediately seen as disruptive, and problems are personal, not structural. Like sin, failure, or weakness. It's individual. Uh, there are redemption arcs, but you have to fall, you submit, and then you're restored. You rarely change the system itself. You're restored by putting faith into the system, right? Into the structure. So I would say this trains audiences to accept hierarchy as natural, seek salvation through alignment rather than through any sort of resistance, and mistake emotional catharsis for real agency. So, what about UFC, boxing, and authentic violence as political aesthetics? What about that? Well, combat sports might seem different because they're real, but ideologically they often function similarly, to all of these other things. They're similar to wrestling and similar to reality TV. They they share a lot with wrestling and reality TV basically. You have hyper individualism, winners succeed through personal grit, not collective support. There's a naturalized hierarchy. Some people are just dominant. Power looks inevitable. You have masculinized authority, which is control, aggression, and discipline are framed as virtues. Spectacle as truth. What you see feels undeniable, even when the surrounding business and power structures are still at least semi visible. And if you look at Trump's association with the WWE and UFC figures and the boxing rhetoric and just his persona, it isn't accidental. That it also ties into the religious messaging. These spaces all normalize a worldview where domination equals legitimacy. Rules are flexible if you are powerful. Spectacle substitutes for governance, and it all ties together. I mean, if you put it simply, soft spirituality lowers defenses, reality TV logic teaches viewers how to emotionally process authority, wrestling and combat aesthetics normalize hierarchy and dominance as themes, Political figures then step into a role that audiences already know how to read. And the issue isn't that Roma Downey is secretly plotting anything. Like I said, it's that the media systems don't need conscious coordination to reinforce power. They just need compatible narratives. The danger isn't indoctrination by force so much as it is habituation to these constant authoritarian style messages. And let's look at what apolitical spirituality has meant in practice in history, what it's lent itself to. So, apolitical spirituality usually presents itself as focused on personal peace, healing, morality, or transcendence. It's suspicious of politics, ideology, or anger, encouraging inward change over collective action, and all that kind of stuff. So, the key point from a critical perspective is that claiming to be apolitical is itself a political position when power is already uneven. And that's why New Age style beliefs so often lend themselves to extremism over time. They can very easily be co opted precisely because they are initially treated as apolitical and neutral. So therefore, if you can kind of co-opt those feelings and that language, well, then you're expanding yourself to a larger audience that is frankly still an irrational audience in many respects because it's more driven by emotion and the vulnerability that comes with somebody who is seeking a higher power or whatever term you want to use. So all of that easily lends itself to extremist movements. And there is a recurring historical pattern here that backs this up. This isn't just some harebrained theory that I'm coming up with. In fact, I'm not the only person who's ever noted this. So, when societies move rightward, especially during periods of instability, apolitical spirituality often plays a seemingly stabilizing role. So, you have Weimar Germany and the Nazi consolidation. And the late Weimar period, there was a boom in mysticism, spiritual revivalism, and inner renewal movements. Many emphasized personal purity, destiny, and spiritual rebirth while rejecting parliamentary politics as corrupt or beneath them. So that all sounds fine and good. So this didn't cause Nazism, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it caused it, but it kind of softened resistance by redirecting discontent away from collective political struggle and toward inner transformation. And once the right consolidated power, spiritual language was easily absorbed into nationalist myth. So it was a pattern that really lent itself to that environment, that authoritarian environment, spiritual transcendence over material analysis, paired with depoliticized public sentiment, and that paired with easier authoritarian capture because the public was disengaged from politics and they didn't understand what was at stake in a lot of cases. And of course, you pair that with fear of outsiders, in this case, anti Semitism, and of course, anti communism and anti this and anti that, just xenophobia in general. And you have an initially depoliticized public that became politicized. And because it was initially apolitical, well, then it makes uh, the political co-option of that rhetoric and those sentiments seem more natural. And there's also the Cold War and the United States and the New Age movement, which is interesting. The post 1960s New Age boom stressed consciousness, vibes, energy, and personal awakening. At the same time, labor movements weakened and structural critiques of capitalism were reframed as negative or low consciousness. And corporate and state power benefited from a culture where suffering was individualized and framed as a mindset issue. This period also saw the rise of prosperity gospel, which translated spiritual virtue directly into material success. That was its own pattern. You have systemic problems paired with being reframed as personal spiritual failure or a growth opportunity. Okay, so what about the late Soviet Union and post Soviet Russia? Are there examples there? Well, I guess there are. As communist ideology collapsed, spiritual revival and mysticism surged. So you had Orthodox Christianity reintroduced as a cultural anchor, initially framed as moral, not political. This spiritual revival later became tightly coupled with nationalism and state authority. So you have a pattern here too of spiritual roots used to fill an ideological vacuum, then mobilized by the right. What about the neoliberal era from the 1990s to the present day? Well, you had widespread precarity, burnout, and institutional distrust that created a fertile ground for spirituality that avoids naming economic power as a problem, discourages anger or collective struggle, emphasizes resilience and acceptance, and right wing movements benefit because anger is redirected inward or spiritualized, whatever that actually means. I'll let you figure that out. Solidarity is often replaced with self optimization, self help, and all that. Hierarchy is reframed as natural order or destiny. And this doesn't require explicit right wing messaging. It's structurally useful to the right, regardless of original intent. And this works so reliably because the core issue is power insulation. Apolitical spirituality, if you think about it, um, it tends to legitimize existing hierarchies by refusing to name them. It frames obedience, patience, and humility as virtues. It treats conflict as a moral or emotional failure rather than a political reality. And meanwhile, right wing movements are often compatible with hierarchy, authority, mythic narratives, emotional certainty, and all that kind of stuff. So the two do not clash as much as they interlock. And this kind of differs from left spiritual traditions. It's important to distinguish this from spiritual ideas that explicitly challenge hierarchy, like liberation theology, anarchist mysticism, and some forms of Buddhism. There are some forms that link inner transformation to collective material change, and they treat spirituality as a source of resistance to corruption and violence in society rather than a sort of resignation. And there's a dividing there's a dividing line that isn't belief versus unbelief. It's whether spirituality interrupts power or smooths over its rough edges. Bringing it back to media and culture, in ecosystems, spirituality provides emotional glue, spectacle provides identity, politics arrives later wearing familiar robes, you know, and familiar roles. And by the time overt right wing messaging appears, the audiences already trust the authority figures, accept simplified moral frames, feel politics should be emotional, not analytical, and that's how something can feel gentle, inclusive, and above politics while still preparing cultural ground for an extreme rightward shift. And I hope that provides some food for thought because I sure said a lot of words in this episode. All right, I'm probably going to get a drink of water because I was talking for a long time uninterrupted. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will most certainly be back next week.